Word. Word to your mothers, parish orphans and retrogrades. Happy Friday. Today I'm going to be talking about our worst president ever, maybe our worst leader ever, ecumenically speaking, in America. Abe Lincoln. Abe Lincoln's like the grandfather I never had. That's what people all think. You've been taught to think Abe Lincoln, Honest Abe, was a good Christian man who loved you and helped widows, didn't hold seances in the White House by any standard means, loved people of all colors of the rainbow, loved the South as well, was not a tyrant, and had a super badass beard that didn't connect here. That's the only true part. The last part is that he had that weird beard that LeBron James took and ran with. Was the weird beard that doesn't connect. And even that's a lie because it's not super badass. Today we're going to be talking about why Lincoln wasn't super bad, why he was the worst leader that the United States has ever had, why you've been, maybe, dare I say, I know in 2025 it shocks the conscience, you might have been lied to by public schools and media, and Steven Spielberger, Senor Spielbergo, he might have lied about how good Lincoln was. Can you believe that? A movie maker, non-Christian guy might have lied. It's funny because conservatives are like, yeah, the media lies. Everything's fake news. You can't believe anything, man. Then they're like, oh, it's February, the month where I go worship Lincoln. You know, well, for a full month long, they're like, Black History Month, that's a bunch of DEI crap, which it is. But I'm late to a Lincoln worship fest. Lincoln wanted to be a Freemason, applied to being a Freemason in Illinois. Then he realized in the election of whatever it was, 59-60, it would be bad for him. He hated Christians, wanted to be a Freemason, admired him all his life, spoke like he was kind of friendly with Christians because he wanted to win an election. And I got the goods. As always, I bring the receipts. That's today's show. He's an evil, evil dude. He conscripted Giuseppe Garibaldi to wage war on the American South, slaughter 700,000 of his own countrymen for a reason you probably don't know. And he got the Freemason Giuseppe Garibaldi to do it because Lincoln admired so much that Garibaldi had basically in the decade of the 1860s, beginning then, had declared war on Pope Pius IX, literal war, and was holding Pius IX a prisoner of the Vatican. Those are Pius's own words. And he stole the papal lands. And Lincoln said, what you just did to Pius IX, I want you to do. I want you to be a major general in my army. I'll show you the letter that he sent through Secretary of State Seward. And Lincoln hated Catholics, just like Garibaldi hated Catholics. Pius IX liked the Confederacy. You've been lied to about that. That didn't mean anything. Yeah, it did. Lincoln and Garibaldi and all the Masons and early proto-socialists of the world wanted something called liberal nationalism. It's a forerunner to globalism. They hated Catholic subsidiarity. And they all corresponded with each other in letters and stuff. So we're gonna learn all about how this affected the nascent or semi-nascent American ideological morphology, what became the political parties, what became the 14th Amendment is really Lincoln's legacy, and how this messed up modern America right after Lincoln died. His legacy to America, his dark legacy, gave us the forced legalization of, because he believed in this liberal nationalization thing, unification. Risorgimento is the Italian word that meant individual states cannot stand up. Localities that are Christian cannot stand up against, I don't know, the forced illegalization of local bans on things such as contraception. Prawn. abortion, sod, Homo sapienism, and eventually sod marriage. All 5 of these things come from Lincoln's ideological presidential birthright, which is the 14th Amendment, which is what he fought, what he had lots and lots of Americans fought and bleed for. The 14th Amendment. That's everything Lincoln was striving for. He didn't really care about the slaves. It's not really at all related to the ideologies, incipient ideologies of the Civil War. It was all about ratifying a new constitution, and that new constitution is called the 14th Amendment, and it would allow the federal government to subjugate the states and force things like those 5 vices. That's just 5 examples. Contraception. It's illegal under the 14th Amendment for states to ban contraception. It's illegal under the 14th Amendment for states to ban porneia. It's illegal for states, was illegal for states to ban abortion. Same thing with Homo sapienism and Homo sapien marriage. So I'm going to tie off all these threads for you and make all the connections. It's all about liberal nationalism, which is the 19th century forerunner to 20th century globalism, which became a big deal in the 1930s and 40s. Guys like H.G. Wells, Tavistock folks, all of those socialist writers were proto-globalists. Rockefeller, Ford, those dudes who are all talking about the open conspiracy, globalism, one world government. In the late 19th century, their forerunners had to move from true little tiny subsidiarian republics like the Papal States, Vatican City, Venezia, Forza, as they say in Venezia. They had to force them all into bigger conglomerates like Italian unification, Risorgimento. The United States, you can't have the states having their own police powers, the real sexy power to regulate health, safety, welfare, morals. That's called the 10th Amendment police power. You got to get rid of that shit. And you have to have bigger fractions of hemispheres. Then you can do globalism. So Lincoln and Mazzini was another big Freemason friend of Garibaldi. Garibaldi himself, Marx, who Lincoln and Marx were admirers of, all of Lincoln's best friends, like Horace Greeley, who ran the New York paper. Many in his cabinet were Marxists. They all believed in, first we need to do these big liberal nations that are much bigger than the incipient republics, which actually constitute meaningful constellations of people groups, like the peoples of West Virginia. They're actually a people group. They have one climate. They all can farm one thing. They have one kind of economy. They understand their local problems. They understand their local strengths. That's a people group that should be a republic. Well, in the late 19th century, latter half of the 19th century, the proto-socialists, proto-Marxists, they all had to do away with that. And it was a big goal, the big goal, I should say, of the Masons whom Lincoln longed to join and whom he attempted to have lead the Union forces. I'm going to tell you all about that story, how he tried to get Garibaldi to subjugate the American South, just as Garibaldi had subjugated Pope Pius IX today. There's a lot of interesting deets, so that's what we're going to do. Before we go, I'll just say this. You need to get yourself in the spirit of American anti-Lincolnian subsidiarity out of your blue state, get to a red state. Go to www.realestateforlife.org, and you can contact and be helped by a Catholic pro-life person who will help you get out of the red state, get out of a blue state, get to a red state, like I did. I got out of the bluest of the blue, got to the reddest of the red. I suggest this swath of states here in the American Southeast. The people who were subjugated by Lincoln and their grandkids and great-grandkids still haven't forgotten it. realestateforlife.org. Also, if you want to support this show, first off, just subscribe. Help us reach our goal of 100,000 subscribers. Click the like button. And if you want to help more than that, Locals is the way to do it. It's attached to this vid. And if you want to just give a donation, go to timothyjgordon.com and click donate. Also at timothyjgordon.com, we have classes. We have 2 new live classes coming up in March. We're going to have an apologetics class, and we're going to have a Why Am I Still Single section. Those will be taught live weekly. Go to timothyjgordon.com for those. And all the 20 or 21 other classes that we run in loops, pre-recorded there. So, for starters, we have a lot of people, I'm sure, in the chat. It's like, what are you talking about? My public school taught me Lincoln was so good. Where do you get off? Where do you get off, sir? Saying,
what the hell do you think of yourself?
What the hell do you think of yourself? Saying, you're just shocked that maybe, well, here's a way to jolt you awake in the morning. Maybe you even haven't had your coffee yet. Sometimes the public schools and the popular news media, who's not run by Christians, might actually lie to you. What? Sometimes they try to do things like tell you naughty things which aren't true, and they pitch them as good things which are true. So I know this is brand new. I'm like the first guy that suggested this to you, and it hasn't been in the water for decades. But I'm here to tell you on the last day of February 2025 that, and it's appropriate. I wanted to fit this show in February because I wanted to, proverbially speaking, piss on Lincoln's grave, and that's best to do in the month that every other normie who's been brainwashed so badly is out there still celebrating him. They lie to you, and you know this, so don't. Before you know anything real about Lincoln or what his ideological legacy was, don't get on your high horse with me. I mean, wait until the case is made. All right, so here's a brief lesson in political philosophy. America has had, in its relatively brief life, has had 3 eras already when we talk about issues of federalism and anti-federalism. The 2 primary poles of this, when we're talking about representative government and whether or not it's going the way it's supposed to go, it's supposed to go the way of confederation. That's good. If it goes the way it's not supposed to go, according to Catholic teaching, that way is called consolidation. Now, I don't want to talk in terms of the 3 good regimes or the 3 bad regimes, according to Aristotle and St. Thomas, and pretty much all of the thinkers between Aristotle and Montesquieu. There are basically 3 good regimes. You can have good rule by one, serving the common good. You can have good rule by few, serving the common good. You can have good rule by many, serving the common good. Or these can be inverted and they cannot serve the common good, and you can have an evil rule by one. It's called tyranny. An evil rule by a few, that's called an oligarchy. Or an evil rule by many, that's called democracy. Democracy is evil. The good versions take the names you're more familiar with, which is monarchy itself. That's the good form, ruling by one. Aristocracy is salubrious, rule by few. And of course, republic or polity is salubrious, rule by many, not democracy. That's not what we're talking about here today. That's basic. What I want to say is that at any level, the good 3 forms of government, rule by one, few, many, should be confederated. That's a natural law principle, according to Pope Pius XI. It's a principle of natural law. It's naturally knowable to your natural reason that whether you're in a basketball game or a football game or a hockey game or a soccer game, the ref that's in the position to make the call should make the call. And this usually, basically always means localism. you should be governed by one who is near, and that almost always involves some aspect of self-rule, even in a monarchy. That means a confederated form of government where little local pockets or shires or localities of people who understand their own strengths, weaknesses, climate, people, crops, manufacturers, they are in the position to make the call. In other words, if you want a neighborhood, a road outside your neighborhood or leading to your neighborhood or an arterial road in your neighborhood sort of cleaned up, you're going to talk to your neighbors about it. Like, hey, what should we do about this? You don't call up Washington, D.C. or The Hague and say, what do you think about the edging and the garbage, the flooding issue on this arterial road in my street in Hattiesburg, Mississippi? They're going to be like, what are you talking about? That's because it's a natural law principle that basically all of government is close to home. It's perverse. It's perverse. And, in the book of Revelation, one world government is diabolic. To assume that someone 5,000 miles away, that's the distance between Honolulu, Hawaii, and Washington, D.C., can have anything meaningful to say. You cannot be governed by someone 5,000 miles away in a meaningful way. Not as per the police power, which is health, safety, welfare, morals. The big, sexy legislative fields, which can be occupied by a local government or a faraway government, have to be occupied, not because I say so or even the Catholic Church says so, though both of us do, but because nature dictates that. The nature of optics, the field of optics dictates that the close referee makes the call as to, like, was that guy's foot on the line? Was that wide receiver's foot on the line as he grabbed the catch? Now, it might come down to a millimeter. You need the ref that's looking at it. There are line judges whose whole job is just to look at it, not the guy across the field, not the guy from Washington, D.C. So it's a natural law principle, and it's pretty self-explanatory. If you want to take your wife on a date, you have to hire someone to come stay at the house. You can't govern from the restaurant you're going to with your wife if your kids are small. How many other examples do you need? That is a confederated sort of government. When you talk about the fact that nations are now not nation states anymore, they're not polises, unfortunately. They have two or more cities inside them. So they're really confederations of groupings of people that make the basic unit of a grouping of people is like a city, a small city. And that's why good representative rule was always done by nation cities, polises. Okay, but we've gone a bit larger, more macroscopic in our scale, and we're not going to get back the nation city polis that Plato and Aristotle were used to. That sucks, because that has real subsidiarity baked in. But we at least need confederations of cities and small states that govern themselves, but for the sake of having one, republic, in this case of the United States of America, they can govern themselves locally as to this so-called police power that's implicit in the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, but they can band together for the very, very few national issues. There are a few issues of relevance where it doesn't violate the natural law, this is even according to Pius XI, for these confederated cities or states to band together on. Usually it's national defense. Okay, we can argue about whether there should be a national tax, whether that's even just. But if it's just, to the extent it's just, that's one thing. Building postal roads to connect the many, many confederated cities and states, that's another thing. Consolidation, on the other hand, means there's one nerve center, Washington, D.C., and it governs all the police powers, the sexy governing legislative fields. health, safety, welfare, morals. Consolidation is evil. It violates the natural law. It is a grave violation of the natural law to have a consolidated government. Pius XI says this. He doesn't use the terms confederated and consolidated. He coins the term subsidiarity to correspond with confederation, and he uses the term grave evil to correspond with violations of subsidiarity. Now, Madison and the other two writers who pseudonymously authored The Federalist, they're the ones that use this 18th century lingo, confederation, consolidation. But now getting back to the three eras of America's ideological morphology, we had a period of pure confederation as Americans, as post-British subjects, as post-colonists, of pure confederation. I think that's the best. By pure confederation, we mean not only did the 13 states of original America govern themselves on the police power, but they actually had kind of hard political boundaries between and among them, even for the collection of taxes. We were on something called were on something called the requisition system. They didn't have a national tax. On this pure confederated system of 13 basically countries that just band together to fight England, and a few years after, they didn't even have three branches of government nationally. They had three branches of government to govern over each state, but they had just a federal Congress. So I'm talking about this in this first era of three, the era of pure confederation. I'm talking about a time when the 13 colonies become states, beginning in 1776. This would only last 12 years until 1788. Not only had the police power, which would continue into the second era of America after the new Constitution of 1788, but they had a hard political divide where there were basically 13 separate countries that operated under sovereign diplomatic immunity principles, international gov principles. And that's why in American discourse, you know, if you know anything about civics, most people don't, but if you know a little about civics, all of our terms correspond with what's called treaty government. Congress is a treaty government term. Congress is not typical. It was a new term in the political badinage in the 18th century outside of the context of treaty gov. Treaty means two sovereign countries band together to fight against one common foe. And by sovereign countries, I mean Virginia and Georgia. So the Congress only met once a year from 1776 when they got the Articles of Confederation. They were confederated, and they were open and notorious about that distinction. For those years during the war, about 5.5 years during the war and about 6.5 years after the war, they were confederated. They used treaty government terms because it represented a treaty government mode of thought, meaning we're 13 separate countries fighting against Bonnie King George, the tyrant, and especially Parliament. That's why they use terms like Congress. Oh, also, a foedus from Latin, federal, foedus. This is a treaty gov term, and it corresponded to sovereign international countries banding together, forming a kind of Congress. There are others. I studied in law school under a guy who'd studied under John Finnis, and he knew all the treaty gov terms in the American discourse. It's like all of them. But the point is, these are not terms of even subsidiarity yet, because under this first era of American political morphology from 1776 to 1788, we had one document which was roughly modeled around the Magna Carta, but it wasn't, it didn't represent one republic. It represented 13 separate colonies declared their independence with one voice in 1776 against one common tyrannical foreign entity, the biggest, most powerful government in the world. 13 separate ones, and they pledged, they would band together and fight, kind of like an early proto-World War, like a non-stupid, non-gay World War. America shouldn't have been involved in either of the world wars that it fought in, but this is kind of one. It was a bunch of European-like nations, Georgia and the Carolinas and Virginia and the northernly guys, banding together sovereignly in 13 separate ways to fight against England. And they're united only by one branch of government, a legislative branch that met just once a year in something called a Congress. If you know Tolkien, like a moot is also a meeting. Congress was a kind of a moot. And again, it corresponds with treaty government. So it proves that when we fought the war from 1776 to 81, 82, depending on your view of history when it ended, they were just 13 countries banding together. And that after that, we still operated under the Articles of Confederation, the government of which I've just described, for the next 6.5, 7 years, until the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, when some shysters, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, James Madison of Virginia, who was always kind of switching sides and things between the Consolidationists and the Confederationists, aka the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, tried to get everyone together. Actually, they started trying to get everyone together the previous summer in 1786 at Annapolis, Maryland. No, George Washington didn't show up. He was basically worshipped at that point, so no one came. They said, let's try again next summer, summer of 1787. We'll do it in Philly, a little bit further north, to get more northern involvement. The northern states were the poor states, and they needed them as well. And we'll bring George Washington. So in that summer, Virginia sent a couple delegates, both of whom were against the proposal in Philly in 1787. And the proposal was, let's amend the Articles of Confederation. So the guys that went, who were, I think it was it Edmund Randolph or Edmund Pendleton? They're both Virginians, together with George Mason, my favorite of all the founders, despite his bad last name. One of the Edmonds plus George Mason showed up, and they're both like, well, you all said that we should be here to amend the Articles, which require, by the way, a unanimous consent of all 13 parties to it to dissolve. You can go read the Articles of Confederation if you don't believe me. But when we showed up, the first thing you did in Philly was you shuttered the windows, and you said with a bare majority or 2/3, I forget what it was, not unanimity, we're going to not amend the Articles, we're going to shit can them, and we are writing a new constitution. But by the way, this thing's already written. It didn't have the amendments yet. But James Wilson of Pennsylvania and James Madison had already written them. And they'd shuttered the windows, and it was what's called a runaway convention. And the two delegates from Virginia, the most important state in the Union, with strong Confederationist, anti-federalist leanings, were like, no, we're not going to do that. And they brought this back to Virginia. In the summer of 1788 was when the individual state houses by all 13 states were to vote on it. I studied in great detail in law school the Richmond Ratification Convention from the next summer, 1788, when the most important guys in the country, remember 5 of the first 6 presidents were Virginians. That doesn't even include like the coolest one, George Mason. A lot of the coolest ones were never even president. The Lee brothers, George Mason, tons. Edmund Randolph was never president. But they're arguing it out, whether or not we should join this new proposed constitution. And the new proposed constitution, which did end up getting ratified in June, I forget what it was, June 23rd or 24th, 1788, got ratified. They didn't have the news to know it during the Virginia Ratification Convention, because all they needed was 9 out of 13. Even though it was supposed to be 13 out of 13. They were supposed to be just amending the Articles. It was a proposed document that, in James Madison's words in Federalist 39, said this government's going to be part confederated and part consolidated. And it was going to be a mix between states' rights and between, on the other hand, consolidated government from Washington, D.C., which would be 3 branches. It would have a national legislature, a national judiciary, a national executive branch. But it did plentifully leave room for subsidiarity. And the best way we know this is because in this document, in Article 1, which said what the national legislature could do, Section 8, it lists only 15 powers. And those 15 powers are really unsexy. None of them correspond with the things that states would be left to do in view of governing themselves. The police powers, health, safety, welfare, morals. All the sexy laws that we argue about when we argue about, should we ban contraception, porn, abortion, SOD, stuff like that. That's all a police power. Okay. In the second era of government, which began in 1788, when the 9th state did ratify the Constitution, the new Constitution, it was a mixed regime because there would be a national government. It wasn't supposed to have a national tax. That's what they just fought the war over 12 years earlier on, was capitation taxes. We didn't have that at first. It didn't have a national bank, a Federal Reserve. That's obviously tyrannical. That's something, another thing James Madison would kind of sell out on. That's really evil. That's a violation of subsidiarity. So is having an IRS. That's obviously a violation of subsidiarity. Capitations are what they just fought and bled for against Great Britain. Direct taxes. Nonsense. An income tax. Fundamentally unjust. But excises and imposts are not fundamentally unjust. The government has the right to do that. But the point is, under the U.S. Constitution ratified in 1788, it was going to be a mixed regime. Article 1, Section 8 listed out these really unsexy things that would be done from Washington, D.C., like laws by Congress on coining money, the rest, postal roads. They have nothing to do with sexy police powers. The one power listed in Article 1, Section 8 that the Anti-Federalists looked at funny was the so-called interstate commerce power, which ended up being the way they crammed everything through. We call it hollow out, the little hole they poked and made wide. That ended up being a big problem. Well, the Anti-Federalists looked at the proposed Constitution and they said, we need a Bill of Rights, something that expresses that the states will always have a police power to regulate health, safety, welfare, morals. They got that 3 years later in 1791. And it was just hortatory language. There's no way to enforce it, which is proven because now the national government forces on everyone, usually through the judiciary, their view of police power. The police power was wrestled between 1788 and the Civil War, specifically 1868, all the sexy governing powers. Now, the state governments essentially do nothing that anyone cares about. The state legislatures do nothing. It's all the national legislature, the Congress. And the Congress has their tyrannical power vouchsafed now by the courts, and we're going to talk about that. It all happened actually after the Civil War. I say that this middle period of a mixed regime, mixed confederation and consolidation goes from 1788 to 1868, which is 3 years after we're told the Civil War ended. The passage of the 14th Amendment, which is actually, it's Lincoln's legacy. It's what he wanted to do. He wanted to subjugate the states. We're going to talk about that. And he wanted to do everything from a nerve center, a unification, which violates Catholic social teaching, which violated the Papal states. And he had, literally, Lincoln, we're going to talk about why he loved Garibaldi and the Freemasons so much and tried to get them on his side. Because they'd just done this to the Vatican, whom Lincoln viewed as evil. Lincoln said this about the Pope before we get into it. He said, for popery will have been swept away from our land forever. Highly similar to a quote by Garibaldi when he says about the pontificate, that pestilential institution which is called the papacy, which he just marched on. So it's meat to say that from 1788 until 1868, for those 80 years, we had the regime of this new constitution, which was somewhat unjustly snuck in by what's called a runaway convention in Philadelphia in 1787. A year later, it was ratified by enough of the states. The ones that didn't like it didn't want to be left out in the cold. They had the French and Indians and English to contend with. So they kind of got forced in, shoehorned in. So that's the period of mixed regime between the passage of the Constitution, and luckily they did get a Bill of Rights that wasn't all that effective in 1791, for the next 80 years until the passage of the 14th Amendment, which represents a wholly new Constitution, which gets around all of the semi-ingenious checks and balances of the original Constitution. None of them matter anymore after the passage of Lincoln's 14th Amendment in 1868. It just destroys the system, the mixed regime system of confederation, meaning states have the right to govern themselves, state legislatures, on all the most important issues. The national government is consolidated, but only as per taxes, tax collection, war fighting, borders. The government will do the borders. The state militias don't have to. Post roads, things like that. Coining money. There has to be one common money. There wasn't one common form of money under the purely confederated form between the Revolutionary War and 1788, which led legitimately to Shays' Rebellion and things like that in the late 1780s, and made them think, okay, we at least need to coin a common money and have some consolidation. So you can argue that some amount of consolidation was fine. But after 1868, we have a purely tyrannical, consolidated form of government because of the 14th Amendment. We'll talk about it later. It just wholly replaced the Constitution, even though it appears as one amendment among 26 or whatever it is. It's actually the whole Constitution now. And it destroyed the ability of states to govern themselves on the things people really care about, like abortion. Now, the southern states, Mississippi, right after I moved here, wrestled it back by forcing this legal challenge, which became Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, which overcame the pro-14th Amendment ruling of Roe versus Wade. And I'm going to talk about the white pill here at the end of today's show. Justice Thomas, my favorite guy on the bench, actually is talking about doing to Pam what we just did to Pam, doing to Roe, doing to all the other 14th Amendment tyrannies that the federal government, because of libido dominandi and all that stuff, they want to force porn and contraception and abortion and sod marriage on everyone. You can't leave that to the 50 states. It's illegal for the red states to make it illegal under the 14th Amendment, which is Lincoln's legacy. We're going to talk about Justice Thomas saying, well, we undid Roe with Dobbs. We want to undo all the other 14th Amendment perversions. It's called substantive due process. In a similar fashion. Maybe we can get back to some actual mixed consolidation and confederation. What's up?
I was just going to say there's a bit of questions coming through, so if you don't mind, at the end of the show, allotting some time to answer some of them.
Sure.
People are interested in this.
Sure. So you have to understand, I just wanted to go through this. Once you understand, we've had these three periods. Consolidation, pure consolidation, is from 1868 to the present, to our present day. We just live under pure tyranny from D.C. Absolutely violates the natural law. You know, Washington, D.C. can tell, usually through the judiciary now, a combo of the national legislature and judiciary. Honolulu, Hawaii, it's illegal for you to make porn illegal. Do you understand that? It's illegal for you to make contraception illegal. It's illegal for you to make sod marriage illegal. They did this using a combination of clauses in the 14th Amendment, but it's all 14th Amendment legal theory, legal justification. So this thing that's happened, I can't get off on a tangent here. This is something I could tangent on hard. the so-called post-liberals, any of those who are party or are familiar with the post-liberal argument, they're liars. They hold up Lincoln as a great post-liberal. Lincoln is the father of modern American liberalism. Liberal nationalization, meaning unification, or in Italian, risorgimento, which is just frociagione, is the heart of liberalism. It just means that everything is done from a nerve center far, far away, and it violates natural law. That's what liberalism is. And it always tends toward a certain cultural legislation regime. The cultural legislation regime of far-off government will always be from the nerve center. All of you have to do the socially liberal thing, because you can't use Sauron's ring to accomplish good. The ring is inherently illegal. You can't use a violation of subsidiarity to accomplish good. Good happens in local regions of red states. Or, they don't call it a red state. When it's just good Christian people, I'm even going to include Protestants when I say good Christian people. That's a stretch. But in America, you have good Christian Protestant people. That's the only time you're going to get good culture. You're not going to get it the way the post-liberals want, and which is why they're all liars. All those guys that say, post-liberalism was bad. Wait, liberalism was bad. Who's your hero? Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, Gladden Papin. Who do you guys like? Lincoln. What's your legal theory for doing all this? The 14th Amendment. I debated Josh Hammer at Ole Miss in person, and he's just a little Vermeule clone. And he said, I hate liberalism. I was like, you're defending the 14th Amendment. And I was like, Griswold versus Connecticut, Stanley versus Georgia, Roe versus Wade, Lawrence versus Texas, and what's the homo marriage one? Obergefell versus Hodges. Those are all 14th Amendment cases. You say you like the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is a way for the national government to force its view on a given police power, health, safety, welfare, morals, on the whole hemispheric, like, republic. We don't have a republic. We have a hemisphere. It's too big. And he couldn't believe I was saying this. I was like, you're the liberal. So the guys calling themselves post-liberals who love Lincoln and the 14th Amendment are the liberals. The father of modern European liberalism is Giuseppe Garibaldi, arguably Giuseppe Mazzini. These two worked really close together. They're both like Masons and wanted to unify all of Europe. It's just proto-globalism. Liberal nationalism was the step these guys had to do before they could do outright globalism. Liberal nationalism of the 19th century was the globalism of the 20th century. And it came from all the same Tavistock Republic Book 5 types. They hated the Catholic Church. They hated the pontificate, which always was like everyone should do their own thing in local pockets. That's always what the church is taught. That's just why we've codified subsidiarity. And the post-liberals, I forgot, what's his face? Who's the, I'm forgetting one of the key post-lib guys. Someone.
Lauren here.
Yeah, the Iranian guy. What's his name?
Sohrab Ahmari?
Sohrab Ahmari, thank you. Yeah, so Lincoln's the father of modern American liberalism, or liberal nationalization. The father of modern modern European liberalism is Giuseppe Garibaldi. They both hated the papacy, Lincoln and Garibaldi, of course. And here's why they hate the pontificate, because the pontificate is both a worldly leadership, government, and an ideological one. And it's always saying, look, we want all the world to be Catholic, but we're this tiny little portion of southern and central Italy. We have to have some space. Beginning in 1860, Garibaldi marched on Pius IX's papal states and took from him Sicily. He conquered Sicily, took it literally at the point of a bayonet from Pope Pius IX. Garibaldi hated the pontificate, saying the papacy, being the most harmful of all secret societies, ought to be abolished. This is Grand Master of one of the lodges. Garibaldi, he had a pet donkey that was named Pio Nono, mockingly. Hated him. And we'll talk about Lincoln's appointed meeting with Garibaldi when he tried to get Garibaldi to become a major general in the Union armies. Very well documented stuff. But you have to understand that the liberals that we hate now, I don't call myself a post-liberal because all the post-liberals are corrupt and they're lying about what the stakes of the game are, what the terms of the game are, what the North Pole is, what the South Pole is. But I was never a liberal, never a classical liberal. Classical liberalism, I should say, is a lie. So is what's going around as post-liberalism. I represent the Catholic point of view. Pius IX, Pius X, Pius XI. All these guys said subsidiarity, localism is the way. And the true liberals like Lincoln and Garibaldi hated the church for this. Lincoln wrote, "I do not pretend to be a prophet, but though not a prophet, I see a very dark cloud on our horizon. That dark cloud is coming from Rome. It is filled with tears of blood. It will rise and increase till its flanks will be torn by a flash of lightning, followed by a fearful peal of thunder. Then a cyclone such as the world has never seen will pass over the country, spreading ruin and desolation from north to south. After it is over, there will be long days of peace and prosperity. For popery, with its Jesuits and merciless Inquisition, will have been forever swept away from our country. Neither I nor you, but our children will see these things." And he and Garibaldi together hated the Catholic view of the world. Garibaldi was Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Italy. He's considered the arch enemy of Catholicism at the time, much more than Marx even was. He ran a group called the Red Shirts who marched on Rome and were keeping Pope Pius IX prisoner in the Vatican. They unified all of Italy, which, again, brainwashed Americans, even conservative normies, think, oh, isn't that good? They had a big nation now. Well, nationalism is better than globalism, but it's a form of globalism if you're talking about forced nationalism, because what's better than nationalism? Localism. He marched on Blessed Pius IX's papal states at sword point. He had a pet jackass mockingly called Pio Nono. And on September the 8th, 1861, Lincoln, through Seward, offered him commandership of the Union Army. And it's quite a dramatic tale. Garibaldi had already stolen Sicily from Pius IX and would eventually march on Rome. And Pius IX was basically forced to just stay in the little version of Vatican City. Neither he nor the next four popes, that is Pius IX, Leo XIII, Pius X, Benedict XV, Pius XI, all five of those popes would refuse to venture out into, if you know Rome, you know how close it is to, they refused to go a mile east on, what's that eastern road from St. Peter's Square? We used to go to Castroni Cafe to get pumpkin mix to make pumpkin pie.
The main drag right in front of it.
I'm forgetting what that main drag is, but you can't go half a mile east. All five of those popes never ventured outside of Vatican walls because they say that would have been signaling their approval of them being held hostage by these liberal unifiers, a unified Italy. So Lincoln identified with the Freemasons, Garibaldi and Mazzini, because that's what the Masons wanted to do. They wanted to take the little local republics like Venice and the city of Rome and Sicily and Sardinia and unite them all into one sort of global nation. this huge nation of Italy, and take, you know, the American South, which is very different from the American North, and just said, hey, we want to go our separate way, and keep it conglomerated. That was the first step they had to do before globalism. And they knew, remember, the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita was out. It had been out since the 30s or 40s, 1830s or 40s. They knew this was going to be a 100 years war. Globalism is the eventual goal. First, you have to do big nationalism. I mean, our nation's basically, it's like a third, 40% of the population of the Western Hemisphere. I forget what it is. It's a third of a billion people. That's not a nation. That's a significant piece of a hemisphere. It's not a real country. So let's talk about this for a little bit. Let's talk about.
I'm going to send you the questions that people are posting in chat on your text. So you can read them at the end.
Lincoln was so excited by Garibaldi's war of northern aggression on Pius IX and the Papal States that on this date I just read you, he would offer Garibaldi command as a major general of the Union forces to repeat this violence. And Lincoln ended up massacring 700,000 of his brothers, people he considered his brothers in the South. Lincoln had sent an envoy, Henry Shelton Stanford. I think there was another guy too, George Perkins Marsh. He sent these two guys to Garibaldi's private island, where Garibaldi was living in exile because he was like this Marxist, Masonic red shirt who had taken place in a number of revolutions around the world, not just the bloodshed against Pius IX. He went to the private island of Caprera to conscript Garibaldi. The date was September the 8th, 1861. Lincoln and Garibaldi shared the belief that popery exercised an evil international threat. They represented a true internationalism. A guy like Lincoln, Garibaldi, the Masons. And of course, you know, the Roman Catholicism and the institution of the pontificate does represent a threat on liberal nationalism, progressivism, egalitarianism, the so-called brotherhood of all mankind. All of that French Revolution, secular humanist crap.
Get away with words.
From the concurrent, which was going on at the same time as the American Civil War, the Italian Civil War. It was the exact same thing happening. It was called Risorgimento, or unification, where all these peoples wanted to be free and maintain. If you go to Venice, those people are very fiery, right-wing, pro-subsidiarity people. Their slogan is Forza Forza. Their symbol is the Lion of St. Mark. They're very good people. They don't want to be part of this big, queer, liberal nation called Italy. Bigger always means queerer, always means more perverse, always means a step toward the man of sin, the man of perdition. Globalism. You have to understand that. Dummies out there, normies, think, oh, nationalism's base. Nationalism is only base if your nation's the size of less than 100,000. Aristotle thought that 100,000 was too much for one nation. Yeah, it's based if you have a 50,000 person nation. It's not based, okay, what if we just have one nation in all the world? What about two? Okay. So there's a Western Hemisphere nation and an Eastern Hemisphere nation. 4 billion people apiece. Is that based nationalism? People don't think. When does it become small enough? Well, Aristotle did the math. He shows why it's got to be local nations. That's the only kind of based nationalism. Anything else is just pseudo-globalism or real globalism in nationalistic clothes. So Risorgimento is the Italian word that meant, and it was going on from 1860 to about 1869. Exact same war of northern violence and aggression on the South, on the Pope. So you've probably heard Pius IX liked the Confederacy and Jefferson Davis. You were right. And you've heard normies try to explain it away. The Pope, Pio IX, was the only international diplomat operating under sovereign international immunity principles that ever called Jefferson Davis honorable president. No one else ever called him that. He's the only head of a nation state who said you're an honorable. And he says, look, Jefferson Davis wrote him a letter, and he said, all I want is peace. We just want to be apart from this big, queer, liberal, national thing headed by Lincoln. Anti-Christian North. Liberal, national, queer North by Lincoln, who literally had seances at the White House, hated Christians, especially hated Catholics. We just want to do our own thing, man. The Bishop of New Orleans was very, very pro-Pius IX, loved Pius IX. Lots of Catholics. If you go to New Orleans, there's a great Catholic history there. Catholics were treated very well in the Confederacy. They loved Pius IX. Greatest American of all time, General Robert E. Lee, said that the Pope was the greatest lover in all the world of our poor Confederacy. That was a great man there, Robert E. Lee. So as the American War of Northern Aggression, which is what it's called, the Civil War, it's the War of Northern Aggression, was going on from 1861 to 1865. The Italian War of anti-Catholic Northern Aggression against the Pope was going on from like 1860 through 1869. It's called the Risorgimento. Pius IX, yes, highly sympathized with the Confederacy as the parallel victim to the Papal States of a liberal northern aggressor waging a war of liberal unification against subsidiarity, localism. You know, it's the secular liberal waging a war against the Christians who just want to go their own way. That's what the Civil War was in America. That's what the Civil War was in Italy. On December 3rd, 1863, if you don't believe me, Pius wrote Confederacy President Jeff Davis a very warm reply, calling him honorable president, congratulating him on his desire for peace, and condemning the peacelessness of the North. This is what he said to him. Would to God that the other inhabitants of those regions, the northern people, and their rulers, seriously reflecting upon the fearful and mournful nature of intestine warfare, meaning a civil war, not like you've had Taco Bell, intestine warfare, might in a dispassionate mood hearken to and adopt the counsels of peace. And he's saying, you just named it, Jefferson Davis. So this is a very real kinship felt between Jeff Davis and Pius IX. And Jeff Davis had attended Catholic school and loved Catholics and had lots of Catholic-friendly policies in the South. There's another great Twitter thread I want to read to you. Sal the Agorist posted on Twitter, Lincoln's genocide of 700,000 Americans to collect taxes is how the federal government upended the Constitution, that middle regime, and conquered the states and the people. I reposted another great one with Lincoln's best friend talking about how much Lincoln hated Christians. He hated Christians. Here it is. Yeah, so Lincoln was a vile admirer of Marx, Garibaldi, hater of Christians. There are all kinds of New York Times articles you can go reference, Washington Post articles as well, about how much Lincoln admired Marx, how all of his cabinet was Marx admirers, how much Marx admired Lincoln and what he was doing. Lincoln wasn't just an atheist. This is a tweet from Liberty Bell on February 20th. He was aggressively anti-Christian. Who else was rabidly anti-Christian? Communists, keep that in mind. William Herndon, the most faithful friend of Lincoln, was so outraged at the falsehoods put forth about Lincoln's piety in what he called the pretended biographies of his life, that in 1870, he wrote a letter to Ward Layman, another close friend of Lincoln, for which the following is taken. Here it is. In New Salem, Mr. Lincoln lived with a class of men, moved with them, and had his being with them. They were scoffers of religion, made loud protests against the followers of Christianity. They declared that Jesus was an illegitimate child. In 1835, Lincoln wrote a book on infidelity and intended to have it published. The book was an attack on the idea that Jesus was Christ. In 1854, he made me erase the name of God from a speech I was about to make. He held many of the Christian ideas in abhorrence. He held that God could not forgive sinners. The idea that Lincoln carried a Bible in his bosom or in his boots to draw on his opponent is ridiculous. This Liberty Bell tweet from about a week ago. And I responded to that tweet, and I show his invitation to Garibaldi. Somewhere in this thread of responses, I also show a newspaper clipping that says Lincoln was a great admirer of Marx. Another one's a gathering of communists in 1931 that had a picture of Lenin, Stalin, and a bigger picture of Lincoln's side profile. So you have to see this for what it is. Nationalization, liberalization, unification, risorgimento, whatever it is, forcing people to join the empire stormtroops when they just want to be local and do their own Christian thing is evil. And this was the 19th century Masonic / Marxist goal, particularly in the latter half of the 19th century. While Lincoln consolidated the U.S., his good friend Garibaldi consolidated Italy, had conquered Sicily as early as 1860. I already told you that those popes, three of my favorites, the popes from Pius IX, who was the pope during the Civil War we've been talking about, including Leo XIII, probably my very favorite, Pius X, one of everyone's very favorite, Benedict XV, Pius XI, who actually gave us the term subsidiarity and said violations of it are grave matter in the 1931 encyclical Quadragesimo Anno. They all refused to even leave their front door, the Vatican, because they said that this would be a tacit a signal of capitulation to something called the Law of Guarantees, which was part of Italian unification, which meant, they're not, the Pope isn't the head of state, but we'll kind of treat him like one. It's called the Law of Guarantees. And these 5 popes were like, that's bullshit. No, we'll stay in the small little walled off Vatican City you know now. If you go out there, it's very small. They couldn't even go to Castroni Cafe, where I used to go to get pumpkin pie mix, which is like
$25 million.
Yeah,
because they had to ship it from America.
Yeah, like €18 a piece for a can of pumpkin.
Worth it?
That's like that's 3/4 of a mile away. They wouldn't even go that far to the east. Okay, so these popes were strongly in favor of subsidiarity, of course, because the natural law principle, it's a Catholic principle. Even before the term was given a name by the last of these 5 popes, Pius XI, Pius IX was living out a war in the name of subsidiarity, localism, against the evil liberal nationalist Garibaldi, the Freemason, who Lincoln said, that's great what you just did, the Pope. Come do that to the Christians in the south of my country. After Bull Run, Lincoln and his Secretary of State, Seward, ended up offering 1,000 pounds of sterling silver, right? What is it? 30 pieces of silver to Garibaldi as Major General of the North by these 2 diplomats I was telling you about, Stanford and Marsh. And Lincoln said this: tell him that this government believes he will, if possible, accept this call because, listen to the Masonic language Lincoln uses, this call because it is too certain that the fall of the American Union, he means our big liberal nationalistic Leviathan, would be a disastrous blow to the cause of capital H, human, capital F, freedom, huge Masonic thing, equally here in Europe and throughout the world. This is Lincoln, who'd applied to be a Mason, but decided against enrolling in the Illinois Lodge because he realized that Christians can't be that. And then there's this trip to Caprera by Stanford to deliver said letter. It didn't end up working out, but it was widely celebrated among the anti-Catholic, liberal, secular guys in the North who wanted to subjugate the South and did. You have to see then that even though Lincoln got assassinated in 1865, lots of folks think have asserted that this was Pius IX who assassinated him. I'm not asserting it is, but because up until the last 50 years, people were not brainwashed about the basic liberality of nationalism and the basic antipathy between Lincoln and Pius IX, the basic antipathy between the bad guys who wanted to nationalize and the good guys who wanted locality in the world. It was an understood thing that what eventuated after Lincoln got assassinated, whether it was by Catholics or not, I'm not saying they should have, I'm not saying they did, was the 14th Amendment. So you have to understand this. What the 14th Amendment did that people don't understand is it's longer than all other amendments. It had something called the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which was almost immediately written out of the Constitution within 25 years by something called the Slaughterhouse Cases. The justices there essentially said it doesn't exist, the Privileges and Immunities Clause. A second due process clause, the first due process clause, corresponds with real due process. It's in the Fifth Amendment. It comes up with a second kind of due process, which is called substantive due process, which is essentially what enables the Fed, enables them illegally to destroy the police powers of localities. And also something called the Equal Protection Clause, which has been used to push through liberal Roe versus Wade type crap in conjunction with the second due process clause. All of this is in the 14th Amendment. Justice Thomas has joked for 20 years about how substantive due process is really how they've done all this evil stuff. He's like, we don't even know if substantive due process comes from the DP or the EP. A lot as they're writing law into existence, these evil Freemasons on the Supreme Court in the 20th century, working with the substrate of the 14th Amendment from 1868, they didn't even stipulate, how are we telling individual states that they don't have the discretionary authority to govern themselves? All of the red states, you must understand, had abortion illegal. Most of them were red. When we're talking about the 20th century now, in the wake of the illegal ratification of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, this is Lincoln's legacy, is the ratification of the 14th Amendment. Most of the states were red. 35 or more of them were what we'd consider culturally red before they'd been queered by all this lawfare. And all of them had abortion. All of the red ones had abortion illegal, had porneia illegal, had contraception illegal. Even Connecticut. We don't think of that as a red state. But by 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut. Connecticut had contraception illegal. Using Lincoln's 14th Amendment, a bunch of Freemasons on the court. We had, by the 1940s, we had 7 out of 9 U.S. justices were all Freemasons, doing what they'd planned to do since the 1800s. By the 1950s, 8 out of 9 Supreme Court justices were open and notorious Freemasons. And it was in that period of the court that they're like, we're going to take what Lincoln gave us, this big gift, the 14th Amendment, and now we're going to do with it, with its clauses, what it was born to do, to destroy localities, to destroy the fundamental morality of localities. We're going to make it illegal in 1965, using the 14th Amendment, for any red states. There can't be one red state in the Union that makes contraception illegal, even though most of them had it illegal. That case was called Griswold versus Connecticut. It used the 14th Amendment as the legal theory to justify banning contraception illegal. It changed like 35 states' policies of contraception's illegal. That was 1965. They did the same thing 4 years later in 1969 in a case called Stanley versus Georgia. Most of the states, the good ones, the Christian ones, not in the North, but all the rest around the country, had porn illegal. And using the 14th Amendment, the substantive due process clause, that the post-liberals love, even though they claim to hate liberalism, Stanley versus Georgia made it illegal for even one red state to ban porn. 14th Amendment. DP and EP, second due process clause and equal protection clause. 4 years after that, in 1973, you know what happened. Roe versus Wade. They said it's illegal for even one state under the 14th Amendment, for even one state to ban abortion. So it's making local bans illegal. That's what the 14th Amendment does. That's what Lincoln wanted. Under the heading of slavery and all that. I'm not even going to talk this. Notice how that's the first time I've said that word.
Boring.
Boring. You're brainwashed. You're a boomer. You don't understand what's up. You don't know the real count.
That's how they hide all these historical inaccuracy, by the way, is through these victim narratives.
Right.
Where they like threaten you with slavery or mass killings so that you don't just question, like, well, what is the actual history here?
Right.
What actually happened?
You just have to look that boomer in the eye and be like, I don't care. The real game is what's up with the 14th Amendment. The real game is Griswold, Roe, Stanley versus Georgia. 20 years after that, in the mid-90s, Lawrence versus Texas. Using the 14th Amendment, the federal judiciary, and in combination with the federal legislature, said it's illegal now for any of the 50 state legislatures to ban Homo sapienism. Remember, the 10th Amendment supposedly guaranteed, because the anti-federalists, the people at the beginning of this that represent confederated government, good government, subsidiarity, wanted the guarantee that the federal legislature will never try to commandeer from the several state legislatures, the 50 of them, the police power, the power to regulate health, safety, welfare, morals, the four things that really people care about. You guys could do that boring Article 1, Section 8 crap. You can make our postal roads. The Congress, the federal Congress can do that, fine. But we, the several state legislatures, whether 13 or eventually 50, which is too many, can do health, safety, welfare, morals. That's the 10th Amendment. Go read it. The police power is implicit in it. And by the way, this would be also 14th Amendment commandeered 20 years after Lawrence versus Texas. Lawrence versus Texas said it's illegal for any states to say that sod is illegal as an act, which most of the states had sod laws. And then 20 years later, Obama, looking after maybe his own interest, I don't know, said, you're allowed to marry a dude if you're a dude. And that's Obergefell versus Hodges. 14th Amendment jurisprudence.
Is that a big Mike reference?
I didn't say it. But yeah, I mean, who knows? Who knows what that dude's into?
Dudes.
I don't know. Maybe.
Dudes.
Maybe not. Probably. Who knows? But the fun thing is starting in, so there's this whole story of what's called incorporation. The Bill of Rights, the first 8 amendments, only constrained the federal government, which is why you read Amendment 1 and it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. This is another thing you've been normie brainwashed on. The point of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Do you know what that was all about? That was about the fact that the states did and in fact had their own official state religion. What the First Amendment meant was the national legislature, Congress, is not allowed to disestablish the state religions. That also was happening around the Civil War. So another great evil imposed by the 14th Amendment is something called incorporation, which incorporates the Bill of Rights, which only ever said the National Congress can't violate the legislative field operative in each of the 8 amendments. The state legislatures can. The First Amendment in the 1790s and the 1810s and the 1820s and the 1830s, all of the individual states will have their own official religion. like 8 of the 13 states did. It was expected that more would. That did not violate the First Amendment. You know why? Because before the 14th Amendment, it was impossible for a state legislature to violate the First Amendment. The First Amendment was only seen as constraining the federal government, meaning we like that with regard to the First Amendment. But the Second Amendment just meant that the national government couldn't take away your guns. Your state legislature actually could. I don't like having guns taken away, but you just need to make sure you're living in a good state. So what happened there's a case in 2008 called, was it McDonald? There are 2 cases, one in 2008 and one in 2010, when the Second Amendment got incorporated, meaning it's actually kind of a good thing, but it's still using the 14th Amendment, and I don't like it. It made it where that individual states couldn't take away your right to bear arms, which they, under the original Constitution, could do. So it's a little bit confusing if you don't understand the difference between substantive due process and procedural due process. The point is, so there's McDonald. Let me just double check this. McDonald was in 2008, and in 2010 because I want to get to Justice Thomas. 2010 was another case called. McDonald was in 2010, and it was in Chicago. What'd you say?
I said delicious.
Delicious, yeah.
True American.
This is when the Second Amendment got incorporated. Now, in 2008, there was another case in the Second Amendment, called Heller. I think it was Heller, that would have incorporated the Second Amendment against the states, except it was in the District of Columbia. It just said the District of Columbia, which is not any of the 50 states, could not violate the Second Amendment. And what's important here is that, like I already explained, absent incorporation doctrine, it was impossible for a state legislature or the legislature of D.C., which is not in any of the states, to violate incorporation doctrine, right? Only the federal government was constrained by it. The 14th Amendment also made, with incorporation doctrine, the states subject to this. And this vastly, as much as the constellation of power from confederated to consolidated had already run, it made it even more violent a shift. The state legislatures are supposed to be able to do things that the national legislature can't. That's the point. And in that opinion, in McDonald, Justice Thomas makes he literally is making jokes about how 14th Amendment, Lincoln's legacy, substantive due process is such a shoddy, ill-defined, made out of whole cloth, false doctrine that they never even bothered to do incorporation against the states. They never even said, does this come from the due process clause of the 14th Amendment or from the equal protection clause? Justice Thomas says, I don't like incorporation, but if you're going to do it, it ought to be from the privileges and immunities clause. It's in that opinion in McDonald versus Chicago. The 2008 case, I believe, is called Heller. It's been a long time since law school, but I tend to, D.C. versus Heller. And the reason that incorporation wasn't effectuated in 2008, even though it was the same Second Amendment thing, 14th Amendment applying the federal law to the states, was because D.C. is the federal government. It was just in the city. So they had to do a test case, you had to do it somewhere in the states. They did it in Illinois in 2010. So Justice Thomas has been making these jokes since 2008, 2010, how bad of law this 14th Amendment theory of law is. It's a sham. It's a joke. Here's a Newsweek article called "What Clarence Thomas Has Said About Same-Sex Marriage Ruling." He said that he's been making fun of the 14th Amendment, how unjust it is since 2008 and 2010, and those concurring opinions. And then since Dobbs, he's really been heating up, saying what we did to Roe with Dobbs, I want to do to all of those cases that where the 14th Amendment made it illegal for individual states to ban a vice. There's a ban on bans that comes from the 14th Amendment. That's exactly what Lincoln stands for. He's a liberal nationalist. He wants rule from the center, and it's always going to be liberal rule. I'll read you part of this article. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has repeatedly expressed an interest in revisiting the court's decision that established the right to SS marriage. In SCOTUS's 2015 ruling in Obergefell, decided by a narrow 5-4 vote, there's a big story behind that, very corrupt, when we were sold out at the last minute the night before. It said same-sex couples have the right to marry under the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Again, they're like, where does this come from? They don't stand for the same propositions of black letter law, the DP and the EP and the 14th Amendment. But in this whole line of cases, from Griswold to the so-called substantive due process cases, from Griswold to Stanley to Roe to Lawrence v. Texas to Obergefell, there are others. These Freemasons on the court who love Lincoln and the 14th Amendment and liberal nationalism, they're like, we don't even care. Just after the 14th Amendment, we've inverted the confederation of this country. It's a purely consolidated country. We're just going to make it illegal for states to have any police power at all, to exercise any kind of ban at all. So all these morons that think they want to ban porn and think you do it nationally, it's like, it was bannable before Stanley versus Georgia. You want to ban contraception the way Catholics do, it was bannable before Griswold. Ban abortion, well, it was bannable before Roe. Now we got it back. That's all we need. Move to a red state. I don't need national action. That violates subsidiarity. I'm in a state, trust me, that before Lawrence versus Texas had sod laws. Before Obergefell versus Hodges would not let a couple of dudes stand at an altar. So it was decided by, they can't even decide whether it was the EP or the DP in the 14th Amendment that enabled it. They're just Freemasons. They run the Supreme Court. They always have. And Lincoln gave them the go-ahead with the 14th Amendment. But President Donald Trump's 3 appointees cemented a 6-3 conservative majority on the court. That's not true. Barrett's not a conservative, obviously. Justice Roberts is not a conservative. So this is more like a 4-5. It's more like a 5-4 liberal majority on the court in cases that matter. But we did get Roe versus Wade done. Somehow Trump must have secured a promise written in blood that they would get this done, and thank God they did. Last month, Idaho lawmakers called on the court to undo Obergefell, a move that would once again allow states to ban SS marriage, of course. We want this with all of the, and this is written in this February, so it's good enough. Lincoln's, right in Lincoln's face. What Clarence Thomas has said since all this has happened. The court's most conservative judge, since Scalia died, wrote in a dissenting opinion in Obergefell that the majority opinion stretched the doctrine of substantive due process rights, which substantive due process is just fake, found in the 14th Amendment too far. He also, I had the chance to have dinner with him in law school and I missed it because of what was going on with Abby, but I was president of FedSoc and I lament this. I did meet Nino Scalia twice. One time he made fun of my question, but he's a real sharp guy. And Justice Thomas seems like a really not only sharp guy, but nice guy. Good dude.
Super mean.
Yeah, Scalia is so incisive he could be mean. Thomas is a much nicer guy. Remember, he has a truther wife. Said Obama wasn't actually born in America, which he probably wasn't. In its haste to reach a desired result, the majority misapplies a clause focused on due process to afford substantive rights, disregards the most plausible understanding of the, quote, liberty protected by that clause, and distorts the principles on which this nation was founded. Its decision will have inestimable consequences for our Constitution and our society. He added that, quote, aside from undermining the political processes that protect our liberty, the majority's decision threatens the religious liberty our nation has sought to protect. In a concurring opinion to the court's Dobbs decision overturning Roe, this was badass. Justice Thomas called on the court to review other precedents, including what he called the demonstrably erroneous rulings protecting SS marriage, sod, and the use of contraception. So he's saying not only did we just overturn Roe with Dobbs, but in respective order, we should also overturn Obergefell with whatever that case would be, overturning 14th Amendment substantive due process. With Lawrence versus Texas, overturned that 14th Amendment travesty with whatever that case would be called, and overturned the use of contraceptions from Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965. He wrote this: in future cases, we should reconsider all of this court's substantive due process precedents. It's just amazing. I love this man, including Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell. Because any substantive due process decision, this is amazing. This is where he just says all substantive due process is bullshit. It just means 14th Amendment, the way it was intended and the way it's been applied. Because any substantive due process decision is demonstrably erroneous, he wrote, we have a duty to correct the error established in those precedents. Thomas, joined by Alito, the only other rock-solid conservative on the court now. Now that Scalia is dead, it's Thomas and Silent Sam Alito. Also urged the court to reconsider Obergefell when the court declined in 2020 to hear a case from Kim Davis. Remember that Kentucky county clerk who was sued for refusing to issue marriage licenses? Davis may have been one of the first victims of this court's cavalier treatment of religion in its Obergefell decision, but she will not be the last, he wrote in a statement at the time. Due to Obergefell, those with sincerely held religious beliefs concerning marriage will find it increasingly difficult to participate in society without running foul of Obergefell and its effect on the other anti-discrimination laws. It would be one thing if recognition for same-sex marriage had been debated and adopted through the democratic process, but it wasn't. It was always a joke. We were always a Christian nation. If the people had decided not to provide statutory protections for religious liberty under state law, same. But it's quite another, he writes, when the court forces that choice upon society through its creation of atextual constitutional rights, the 14th Amendment, and its ungenerous interpretation of the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, leading those with religious objections in the lurch. He added that Obergefell, quote, enables courts and governments to brand religious adherents who believe that marriage is between one man and one woman as bigots, making their religious liberty concerns that much easier to dismiss. He said that while he agreed with the decision not to hear the case, it was a stark reminder of the consequences of the decision in Obergefell. He's constrained procedurally. By choosing to privilege a novel constitutional right, meaning it was a made-up right that was never considered, deliberated by the folks who actually wrote or ratified that passage in the Constitution, by choosing to privilege a novel constitutional right over the religious liberty interests explicitly provided in the First Amendment, and by doing so undemocratically, the court has created a problem that only it can fix. Until then, Obergefell will continue to have ruinous consequences for religious liberty. So hopefully, we just come to some sort of ressourcement in the country, some sort of re-entrenchment of what's actually at stakes here. The Constitution, which represents that middle regime, which in my view is still acceptable. I'd love to go back to the Articles of Confederation, but that's not going to happen. Versus the purely consolidated form of government under this new Constitution known as the 14th Amendment and substantive due process with incorporation doctrine, all of the evils that are the birth children of Lincoln, springing like Athena from Zeus's head. I won't make a Lincoln assassination joke on that note. Did we have questions?
Lots of them. I texted them to you. Do you have them on there?
Yeah, let's see.
Start with the first one because in all caps, it'll be... There's only one demographic that types in all caps.
Okay, I'm looking here.
It's the boomers, if anybody was...
I don't see any in all caps.
Read the last one?
Oh, the last one.
Yeah.
how should slavery had been abolished since you know better than Abraham Lincoln? That's not what the show's about. So I don't know. Well, I mean, abortion's a much, 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 much bigger, graver deal. And you're not typing in all caps about that, are you? Lady? Is it a lady?
A dude.
Oh, it's a dude. A dude who writes like a middle-aged lady in all caps.
A boomer lady.
Yeah. I don't know. It was illegal in some places. Many of the folks in the South had planned to illegalize it. It's simply not my concern. The point here, that's like saying how if we don't have one world government, I'm doing this in all caps, how is abortion in China, they have forced abortions in China. How is all abortion in China going to end? I don't know. Not my concern. My concern is the state of Mississippi. That's the point. We are only responsible for what goes on directly around us. The North was not responsible for what was going on in the South. The South wasn't, I mean, one state in the South wasn't directly responsible for what was going on in another state in the South, which is why they were returning or trying to return to Confederation. And many of those states in the Confederation were planning to get rid of slavery, but they weren't trying to tell each other what to do state to state. Same thing with abortion. Abortion exists someplace in the world. China. It's the most egregious in China. Are you saying we should have one world government to end abortion in China? Okay, you're not probably. If you're not saying we shouldn't have one world government to solve every problem across a political boundary, then why are you typing in all fucking caps at me? If it's not part of your state, slavery, then it's not your concern. That's the whole point. Subsidiarity. Pius XI endorsed this. Pius IX explicitly endorsed the South. Get it?
Funny because Zelensky's now at the White House, so this is just like a broader scale. You know what I mean? Like, America's not the world's police power, and that goes down even to the individual states.
Right. The rise of the KKK. Very interesting story. There's one of the most eye-opening books I've ever read. Top 3 for me is called Separation of Church and State by Philip Hamburger. A delicious book, not just because
all this McDonald's and hamburger.
The rise of the KKK wanted to overcome the First Amendment, the real interpretation of the First Amendment. They worked with Southern Protestants and Southern Masons to overcome the First Amendment. And by overcome the First Amendment, I mean the opposite of what normies who are brainwashed probably think. You have to read this book. But it's an explanation of the fact that the First Amendment was a guarantee, was an explicit guarantee that the states could never have forced disestablishment by the Congress. That's what the First Amendment means. Oh, yeah. Oh, this is another 14th Amendment thing. So there's a case called, I can't believe I nearly forgot this. Thank you for this. Explain the rise of the KKK. KKK was a major player in the Everson versus Board of Ed decision in 1948. 14th Amendment case, which incorporated the First Amendment, which meant literally the First Amendment with all of its printed language from 1791. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which meant the National Congress was not allowed to disestablish the establishment of of specific Christian sects, covenantism or whatever it is, some form of covenantism in the North, usually Anglicanism in the South. That's what the First Amendment meant. Boom. Then you have 1948, 7 of the 9 justices who presided over Everson versus Board of Ed and amicus curiae were Masons in the South, the KKK, who hated Catholics, the ACLU. Does this seem like strange bedfellows? They're all amicus curiae on Everson versus Board of Ed. You can go check. None of you typing in all caps at me well, because that's not what you don't do. You don't research. Everson versus Board of Ed, here are all the amici curiae. Strange bedfellows. They want a reversal in the meaning of the First Amendment. which you don't understand, brainwashed peoples out there, is that when you have a jurisprudential reversal in meaning in some constitutional text, they don't go and amend the language. They just amend, oh, this means this. The First Amendment went from meaning the states are allowed to have their own sect of Christianity, which 8 of the 13 did at the time of passage in 1791. There's the proof, the smoking gun. Had them for many decades. 2, 1948, Everson versus Board of Ed. Now they're saying that the exact same language in the First Amendment meant that the states could not have their own religion. That's incorporation doctrine. It's another 14th Amendment case. I always forget that Everson, like all those other ones I've been talking about, is a 14th Amendment case. So the rise of the KKK was anti-Catholicism, and they had to give the reversed, opposite construction of the First Amendment, the one that you think the First Amendment really stood for, until 1948, which it didn't. It was accomplished by 7 Masons on the court with amicus curiae, friends of the court, KKK, ACLU, Protestants in the South, because they're so afraid of Catholics. They're like, let's use the 14th Amendment to incorporate the First Amendment against the states. What that means is that the First Amendment, which is the only of the original 8 amendments in the Bill of Rights, which explicitly codify Congress, the C word. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That means Congress cannot disestablish the state legislatures, 8 of the 13 of which had official state establishments of religion. It was the better name for the First Amendment. Well, it's got allegedly 2 clauses, the liberals say. I say the 2 clauses are part of one clause. They call it the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Really, the Establishment Clause was called, until in 1948, and they reversed history, the Masons on the court, it was called the Disestablishment Clause. Congress was not allowed to disestablish Christianity as the official state religion of the states. And you guys didn't know that, 9 out of 10 of you. So that's another evil on Lincoln's hands. More blood on Lincoln's hands is the fact that we now have separation of church and state within the state legislatures. This great country, great until the Civil War, shitty afterwards, was founded so that individual states that entered the Union, even in the mixed form, not even just in the purely confederated form from 1776 to 1788, even in the new form, they codified 3 years into the mixed regime in 1791, a guarantee that states could have an official state sect of Christianity. Now, most of them were, all of the 8 that had it were Protestant, but we could have, theoretically, under the First Amendment, until it was reversed in meaning in 1948 by Lincoln's 14th Amendment in the hands of 7 of 9 Masonic SCOTUS jurists, we could have our own Catholic state, official established religion. The KKK was so afraid of that they reversed the meaning. They joined the ACLU. You think they're arch nemesis. They joined hands because they hated Catholics that much. KKK, ACLU, Masons, and Protestants in the South said the First Amendment means now that Congress can essentially, and not Congress, but the Supreme Court, one of the 3 federal branches, can disestablish the state establishments of religion. The 14th Amendment accomplished all of this. Everson in 1948, Griswold, Stanley versus Georgia, Roe versus Wade, Lawrence versus Texas, Obergefell. And there are others too. These are all 14th Amendment reversals of the good stuff that was originally stood for, not just in the Articles of Confederation, but even the original pre-14th Amendment Constitution. Can you explain where has the overwhelming Protestant domination of the South found its origin? Well, I mean, the country had a Protestant domination. In the lawfare, there was this stupid thing that they did leading up to 1948 Everson decision. They're so afraid of Catholics flooding in through Italian and Irish immigrants. Can hardly blame them, right? You don't want to be overtaken by Italians and Irish, but they're so afraid of them that they literally, the Protestants of the South banded together with the ACLU, Masons, Marxists to reverse the meaning of the First Amendment. That's the lawfare answer. Now, demographically, there are just a lot of Puritans over here. I mean, that story's true. It was mainly a Protestant country, and even some of the Anglicans came over, but it was mainly the Puritans who were trying to get away from the Anglicans, if you know that story, because they thought the Anglicans were too Romish. I mean, that's just a thing. And someone said, please tell me this will be a future book at Timothy Gordon. Fascinating stuff. Read Separation of Church and State by Philip Hamburger. It'll blow your mind. It'll blow your hair back. Law prof at the Northwestern University, great originalist, friends with lots of my legal mentors. Separation of Church and State. My friend Chris Plants, if you remember him, he read it and he just couldn't believe it. The First Amendment meant exactly the opposite of what you're told it meant. It literally just meant Congress couldn't disestablish these state establishments of Christianity. And it was so for like 100 years. For over 100 years, like 150 years, until 1948. 7 of 9 justices who were Masons used the great sort of keystone that Lincoln, the commie Marxist wannabe Mason Garibaldi lover, had left behind, the 14th Amendment. I know it was ratified 3 years after he got assassinated, but it was his great legacy. It's what he really believed in. Was liberal nationalization, liberal domination by states of the big, hemispheric government.
I think the rest of those questions on up were super chats.
What is the ideal size of a nation? I'm thinking about the size of Mississippi or Idaho. No, they're too big. Aristotle's the master of those who know, as Dante Alighieri said, and he said 100,000 was too big. The ideal size of a republic or a little monarchy or a little aristocracy is somewhere under 100,000. Aristotle literally says it. Aquinas reads it approvingly. Aquinas doesn't comment on that. Aristotle says it in book 7 of the Politics, that 100,000 is too many citizens for it to be a real good, one of the 3 good regimes. Aquinas knew that he said it and is approving of it, but Aquinas in his commentary on the Politics only does the first 3 books. I don't know why. But Aristotle's good enough. So Mississippi, far too big. Idaho, far too big. If you hate globalism, just realize that our wildly outsized scalism, sense of proportion, geographically speaking, we're just almost globalists. If you're like, oh man, the original, United States shouldn't be 50, it should be 13. That's the size of a nation. No, that's far too big. That's still a fourth of a whole continent. The 13 states should have been states. Now, if the 13 states actually were capital S states the way they were intended, that will, according to Aristotle, that's still a bit too big. But yeah, I'd take it. The size of Mississippi, Idaho's a huge old place. But I'd take that over this Leviathan, queer, rainbow, 14th Amendment, Lincoln Frechogene that we have now. But yeah, anything bigger than that requires big Masonic government. And they're just pushing the macroscopy more and more violent. They're pushing the big scale bigger and bigger. Mm-hmm. And Lincoln and Garibaldi and Giuseppe Mazzini and Marx and all these people that wanted big hemisphere-sized countries, they were just the stepping stones to, the one world globalism that now is more out and out, and that they think they can do more with technology. And I'm very suspicious of these cats, the post-liberals, who claim they hate liberalism, but say we basically need big liberal nationalism. That's very suspect to me. And I'm very suspicious who's pushing these guys. Why can we go with Aristotle's population for a nation? A doubter would argue it's not realistic with the modern population. It's not modern. I mean, it's not realistic that there are no countries of less than 100,000 because there's no countries of less than 100,000. I mean, I agree. It's perfectly realistic. I mean, Malta still exists that way. No one's taken over Malta.
Vatican.
The Vatican is eventually, because of Pius XII, who I haven't mentioned today, the guy after Pius XI, he worked out an arguably okay treaty, which moved the so-called law of guarantees to an actual acknowledgement that even though they'd had their lands stolen, the Vatican was a sovereign international country. The Vatican. So you think the Vatican needs to be part of one world government? When people say the realistic thing, it just means they're out of ideas. I mean, it's perfectly realistic. You could be Malta. No one's taking over Malta just because they're small. No one's taking over the Vatican just because if countries are small enough, no one even wants to take them over. It's when you get into this middle-sized sort of half negotiation that's a contradiction in terms. Middle-sized nation state that you might be in danger of being taken over. If you're truly small, the way a city-state's supposed to be, no one's interested in taking you over. It's perfectly realistic. What about the new polity brand of post-liberalism? Yeah, I don't like it. I've crossed swords with these guys. They have some better ideas, but they still can't answer to why do they favor why does the new polity ultimately side with liberal nationalists and the so-called post-liberals when it comes to subsidiarity? You have to be willing to say, I don't care about the BS propaganda about slavery and all that. I just think localities have to decide. It's a violation of natural law to have a faraway government telling a closer government anything in the competency of the local government to regulate. That's the dividing line. And those new polity guys just aren't ultimately subsidiarists. Again, and here's the question. They'll say, because Pius XI gave us the term, it's immoral for anyone who's not, for any larger sphere of government to take away what's a competency of any smaller government. It's a grave evil to occupy that legislative space. Well, the trick of the liberal nationalists, aka the post-liberals, has been to define competency particularly rather than generically, meaning if that sphere of competency isn't I say it's generically you're competent of getting rid of slavery on your own if you're a small state. It's in the police power competency of any of those states, and several of them did it on their own. But what the post-liberals will always do, they'll say, well, not particularly, because look at Virginia. They hadn't gotten rid of it yet. I'm like, well, that doesn't mean it's not in their competency. They're like, well, it's not, because they hadn't done it yet. Well, no, then you're just going to be, well, okay. If that's true, on this flawed, here's the proof, on this flawed view of what subsidiarity is and requires, then we need one world government until no countries in the world have abortion, right? You don't say, well, I'll only respect the sovereignty of subsidiarity, of locality, if every single country gets rid of abortion in the world. We need to take over China and have one world government to guarantee there's no abortion. You don't say that, right? You don't say that with regard to slavery or even abortion in the States. I moved to Mississippi. Mississippi's the state that killed Roe. Thank you very much. That's good enough for me. I'm not responsible for what happens in China or what happens in Massachusetts or the commies in California and New York. Yeah, it's like a penal colony. It's a colony of a bunch of blackguards and evil people. Of course they're going to rule themselves with different lawfare than I do here. Same thing with China. And if you disagree with me, well, then I guess you need to petition the U.S. government to go to war with all the world, to have one world government to make sure there's no abortion. You have to understand how subsidiarity works. Why local government is a natural law, natural reason provision. No, the debate with Hammer is not online. It was in person. Tim Lincoln was a Whig, was he not? I forget. Started the Republican Party. He might have originally been a Whig. When I'm talking about Whiggism, I'm talking about the English party, Locke and Algernon Sidney, the Whigs. The American Whig Party was just sort of a wannabe, and I don't know their politics that well. An in-depth video on Napoleon. I haven't done it yet. Maybe someday I will. Never heard such a great political history talk. How well informed. Thank you. Start a new channel for just politics and government. I learned more from these 1-hour episodes than all of high school. Yeah, I mean, thank you. That it almost requires a new channel, because this you'll see. I mean, I ain't complaining, but this will get the couple thousand views because people, a lot of the too many Catholics just don't care. Yeah, I mean, so this whole talk, someone said, could you speak on the difference between Hamiltonianism and Jeffersonianism and their role in the Civil War? That's what this whole talk was. Hamiltonianism is consolidated government. Jeffersonianism was confederated government. Jefferson's right. And if you think, oh, he didn't like religion, he wrote some gay stuff on religion. He's the author of he's one of the two authors of the real First Amendment that said that the Congress should never be able to disestablish religion in the states. Repeat, Jefferson is one of two authors of the original First Amendment, which stated, until it was reversed in 1948, you cannot disestablish Congress. The established 8 theocracies, which were 8 of the 13 states after 1791, after the First Amendment got passed. Isn't it true that when Britain signed the peace treaty that signed it with every state individually? Yeah, of course. This isn't a question. We had confederated government between 76 and 88. I mean, there were representatives from each of those countries, the 13 colonies turned countries, the country of Virginia, the country of North Carolina, the country of Georgia, the country of South Carolina.
Somebody just asked, what do you think of Thomas Sowell?
I mean, I like Thomas Sowell. I don't know what he has to say here. I forget. I like the things I've read. All right, so that looks like it. Thanks for the helpful remarks. Lincoln was, he did have seances in the White House. That's real. He did hate Christians. He especially hated Catholics, and he really hated subsidiarity. And that's what this was all about. I don't know about slavery, or, what about the, once you start saying, let's do away with the Department of Education, people are like, what about the children? Like that. That's not the point, man. These are the real ideas that move history. Masonry, Marxism, liberal democracy. And they're so effective that they brainwash people under, what did you say, Steph? The victimization movements. This is the way they sell it as window dressing to the bourgeois.
Yeah, that's just how they deflect from the major point. I mean, what about slavery? It's like, yeah, I mean, we don't really find it much in really any countries now. I mean, so it's like, I don't know, it just works itself out, I guess.
Yeah, or it wouldn't. It's not my concern. But even in the Confederated States of America that Jefferson Davis was heading, those states were going to have real subsidiarity between and among them. And they would have phased out slavery at various times, state by state, because states are the ones that decide. And Jeff Davis and even Secretary of State Judah Benjamin and the Vice President, I'm forgetting his name, they all understood that what had been lost between 1788 and 1861 at some point, in those 100 years or so, was the sense that the states, percipient states of the Union, can decide the sexy matters for themselves, for better or for worse, pro-slave or anti-slave, pro-abortion or anti-abortion, pro-contraception or anti-contraception. It's up to the individual states. And you can still be under that mixed second regime as it was penned in 1788. You could still have your own conceptions about the things pertaining to police powers, health, safety, welfare, morals. And it was only Marxists, Masons, Lincoln, Garibaldi, Mazzini, all of those progenitors of the New World, one globe world order that were like, no. A whole continent has to agree. Anytime a whole continent has to agree, that's them telling you that from the nerve center, from Washington, D.C., it's going to be a big queer leviathan, and it's going to be always illegal for the Christian red states to illegalize the vices that we would want to. Those things should be banned. It should be banned at the local level, though. It's more important than the outcome, the procedure. That's why Lincoln's the worst president ever. And just a weird-looking person. Have you ever seen him without his beard? The beard's terrible. Him clean-shaven is horrifying. Looks like a skeleton. God bless you all. Deus Volt. Man, that took a long time.